Pilots. We're supposed to trust them, right? When you see them striding through the airport, some act as if they're above everyone else. Cutting to the front of the TSA line of the casual, "Don't worry, I won't take your seat." Ha ha ha. Many have the unmistakable Type A personality, confident, assertive, and not to be questioned. After 9/11, governments worldwide mandated reinforced flight deck doors to protect against external threats. But what happens when the threat comes from within? From the very person we trust with our lives. This is Destination-Aviation. Hello, everyone. Here in another edition of our podcast, back from Oshkosh. As you heard from the last episode, I was up and about my first time at Oshkosh. It was quite enjoyable, actually. As you hear our main title, the World War II aircraft flying over. I heard quite a bit of that when I was up there, but immense, fun, expansive area. Almost too much to really look at, but it was quite enjoyable. I went up there with a group of us and hit a lot of different venues. I enjoyed going over to the Boeing 4-flight tent area. That was enjoyable to see. Just to be around a bunch of people that really kind of enjoy our industry, what it is, what it does. You know, so many times I have to talk to people that don't necessarily like aviation because whether airplanes exist near their house and they don't like the noise or whatever it might be. Not necessarily that they're bad people, but they just have different probably motives or passions when it comes to aviation. So it was nice to be around, you know, a group of people like that and really, you know, see some of the planes like we've all heard. Fifi, a friend of mine who actually works out in Oakland, California. He was working in Midland, Texas when they were rebuilding Fifi. So it was cool to finally see, the B-29 Super Fortress. You know, we've talked about that aircraft before on other episodes. So if you haven't listened to our episodes, go back and take a listen. We've got some interesting stories of things that have happened with B-29s in the past, but actually see one in flight, take off, and they just had done a remarkable job putting that plane back together. So that was really cool to see. And, you know, just getting to experience people that maybe it was like me, their first time there, people have, you know, this is their 50th time going. I actually went up there with an author who's writing a book on aviation, and I think he's pretty much gone every year. More recent times, he hasn't gone, but he was kind of a main staple there for a very long time. So it was pretty cool to see, and just the logistics of trying to get that whole show together is kind of awe-inspiring. So definitely would recommend Oshkosh if you haven't gone. Make some time to go up there. Prepare for the day. People said to take a chair. I didn't, which I was okay with that. A chair would have been nice, but I also didn't mind not dragging it around everywhere. I had another friend that actually flew up with a friend of his. They bought, I think it's a Piper Cub. Can't actually remember. It's a Piper. It might be a Cub. It might be a different style of Piper, but they actually flew up and couldn't make it in. They ended up diverting into Fond du Lac, which, to be honest, is probably fine. I mean, from the Johnny Cash salon, Fond du Lac. I've been everywhere, man. But it's such a fun name to say. We drove up. I went past Fond du Lac. They had some pretty cool airplanes in there. Nice little terminal. Maybe someday I'll put it on the map to actually fly up myself. But they diverted there and then took a bus up to Oshkosh. So lots of people, lots of folks getting involved with the festivities, so it was quite enjoyable. And if you go back to our episode from last year where I didn't go to Oshkosh, but we talked about it, kind of the same story, a sad start to Oshkosh, or the EAA Air Venture. Unfortunately, 2 people were killed when they crashed into a farm field 2 miles south of the Whitman Airport. It sounded like it was a gyrocopter, a Rotorway 162F helicopter, and an ELA-10 Eclipse gyrocopter. It says that they're not involved with the air show, but they were participants, collided mid-air. It's interesting, you know, I was talking about this with the group that we were with, you know, because myself, you know, I put on events, aviation events, and, it seems like every year at Oshkosh, there's usually a fatality or some kind of like that. And so, you know, to know that that's kind of your benchmark is weird. And I'm not saying like in a benchmark good way, but that you just kind of know that there's going to be a fatality. Obviously they have the banner over the air traffic control tower, world's busiest air traffic control tower. And I was talking with some people and they're like, you think that's true? And I'm like, well, regardless of the facts, I mean, while things are going on there, yes, probably is. However, just that style of flying, people with radios or people that aren't communicating with ATC often, they got the helicopters shuttling people back and forth over the event. I'm sure it's just chaotic and hectic. I know some people that absolutely refuse to use radios when they fly. So either, aircraft with bad radios, handheld radios, whatever it might be. I'm sure, bless the air traffic controls up there, because I could just imagine that job in that particular environment is difficult. We're talking about Oshkosh versus like the busyness of like O'Hare, but I'm like, well, you have, mostly scheduled 121 air carrier service, and you're not dealing with folks that either don't talk to ATC often, or they choose not to, or they just don't like using the radios, and you have such an immense amount of that happening too. So kudos to them, and unfortunate for this accident. Always a lesson for all of us to keep on watching the skies around us, and using as much technology as available. Especially up there, I was actually using ForeFlight on the ground, and, there's obviously, where I fly usually around here, we're within the Mode C Vale of O'Hare, so everybody has to have their ADS-B pumping out. Obviously up there, that's not the case. So there was, quite a few aircraft that just weren't showing up as trackable in the skies. So obviously there's always that added risk, but unfortunate for them. Lesson, obviously, for the rest of us, as any accident is, what we can take from it and kind of move forward to make sure that our flying can be as safe as possible. On the Washington, D.C. front, there's been a lot happening there, hasn't there? Yeah, I don't even know. I mean, we had a Trump assassination. That was crazy stuff. I have some friends back in the Pittsburgh airport region. Actually, interesting enough, I had when I lived in Pittsburgh, I was looking for a T-hangar to put my aircraft, and I had reached out to the Butler County Airport. With this site where the assassination attempt happened, there was an airstrip. So when I first, heard about it, like everybody else, I was actually out to dinner. I thought of that. I was like, oh, wow, it's at the airport, because they mentioned the airstrip. But there's a private little strip, it looked like, next to this farm area. But Butler Airport's, right near there. And talked to some friends back at the Pittsburgh airport, because obviously Trump's 757 was sitting at Pitt. And so, I'm sure hospital, rush back to the airport, a lot of craziness there. And then right after that, right north of here, we had the convention in Milwaukee. So there was a lot of TFRs, and, we were dealing with different airspace complexities. It's just been kind of a roller coaster stuff. My friend who lives in Ohio, JD Vance, right up at the Milwaukee convention, was named vice president, and had some awkward starting there, it seemed like, with his cat lady comments and his Diet Mountain Dew. But regardless, we're not really getting into the politics behind it. But we will say one interesting fact is he lives near the Youngstown airport, and I guess JD Vance will be flying around in a 737, and that will be going in and out of Youngstown. So I thought that was kind of cool to at least hear that aspect of it, regardless of your political side of the world. And we'll find out who Kamala Harris chooses as her VP. And who knows, maybe we'll find out what they're doing and where they're flying and where they're going. I'm more interested in the aviation side to it than anything else. So as far as the aviation news and FAA reauthorization, whether it's in the rear view mirror, but obviously appropriations are still coming. The Senate and the House have been sending their bills back and forth on funding levels. It sounds like things are going to stall out as, we go into the August recess on the federal side. And then as we get into the fall, September, October, November, I think everybody's just kind of anticipating a continuing resolution on the federal funding side. And we're not really going to see any movement until we figure out how the elections shake out in November. So we're all just kind of sitting and waiting. If you remember our episode on Boeing, which I hope you do, because it was just right up here, if you go back and listen. So they named, actually, it was back and forth, because how they were going to name the internal person. We had talked about that previously. But Kelly Orterbag, probably butchering that, Orterbag. Either way, has been named the new CEO of Boeing. Orterbag comes from the Rockwell Collins, so aerospace side of the world. He actually retired. And it's funny. So there was an article written by Allison Moreau with CNN, and it was titled "Boeing's new CEO just landed the best and the worst job in corporate America." And I just want to read a little bit of the article here because it was funny. She wrote, "Congratulations, Kelly Ortberg. You just landed the job that is simultaneously the best and the worst in corporate America. Hear me out. As the next CEO of Boeing, Ortberg is taking a once mighty American institution that's languishing in the dirtbag area, like a star high school quarterback who let themselves go after graduation and can't shut up about the glory days." But he's replacing Dave Calhoun, who became CEO in 2020. He took home nearly $33 million in total compensation that year, a 45% increase from the $22.6 million he received in 2022. And also stands to collect another $45 million in retirement from his stock awards over that time period. It's interesting. I was talking with somebody the other day. Actually, one of our best, and I will say the most. I'm going to do my Trump here. The best listener we have. They're amazing. They're the best. But we were talking about compensation, and it's interesting because there's been so much fixation on Boeing and the corporate culture, and that it's fixated too much on stock prices. So it would be interesting to see how they structured the compensation package for Kelly Ortberg. I'm sure he's not hurting considering the Rockwell Collins days, the retirement. But at the end of the day, he's also not doing it for philanthropy. So whatever deal they worked out, I'm sure it's good for his pocketbook, but hopefully it will be good for the company. Like I talk about, I think a healthy Boeing, a good Boeing is good for the aerospace industry. Obviously, there's a lot that they do in the defense side of the world, and not just with what we see on the corporate side. They did have a huge booth at Oshkosh, and I found it funny. There was two guys working on a door inside their booth at Oshkosh, putting screws in it, and I couldn't help but say to them, "Wow, two Boeing employees working on a door, putting screws in it nonetheless." But I don't really think they found it funny. I found it funny. And like I said, a good, healthy Boeing is good for all of us. So I hope they get back to where they were in the glory days. And honestly, right now would probably be the best time if you have money to buy stock in Boeing. Because as we saw with the automobile industry around the 2008 era, that would have been the time to buy. So I would say if you have money, probably now is the time to buy Boeing as well. With that being said, the current share price is $178.27 a share. It was down $12.33 today. Like I said, it's a good time to buy, but it's surely an expensive stock. So unless you have big bucks to invest, it's probably not going to be worth your while. A little bit out of my price range, that's for sure. But I will say the analysts say it's a buy rating, and considering where they at and where they're going, I would say if we look back on this podcast, maybe a year or 2 years from now, if any of you invested into it, I expect something. Maybe buy some of our stickers or something. Moving on. We have some more aviation news to talk about, but I also just need to say, since it is my podcast, I don't care. I'm going to talk about what I want to talk about. I saw earlier that Dexter is coming out with a prequel, and then they're coming out with another, version. Michael C. Hall was very quiet about, how Dexter ended again, with that snow thing that they did up. Anyways, I bought Showtime just for that, because I did enjoy watching Dexter. Sorry about that. That was United pinging in on us, telling us to buy some snacks for our flight. I'm going out to Washington for a conference, and then also the conference has part of the air show out there in Renton where they will have a air show with the Blue Angels, and then there's also a tour of the Boeing plant. So maybe after my Boeing rant there earlier, I'll get to actually see a little bit of the plant area. Anyways, Dexter, back to important stuff. Dexter. So when Dexter ended, what the hell was that? That was a stupid ending where, whatever, spoiler alert. If you don't want to listen to how Dexter ended for some reason, if you haven't seen it in 2024 when the series ended around like 2010, that's none of our fault. But he goes out in the ocean and his boat frickin', disappears, and then he ends up being, a log hauler up in Oregon or whatever. Anyways, now he's up in the snow area, then he gets shot by his son. And it's just so stupid. Like there was that part, right, where even the dialogue wasn't good. He's like, "Oh, well, don't shoot me, son, or your safety's on, just like I taught you." Like it could have been more like a Breaking Bad moment, but in that one, then they ruined it. And so now it's the same that you hear. I remember when Mad About You was supposedly ending and then it didn't end. And they were like, oh, Paul Reiser was like, I have so much more to say. Well, that's basically what Michael C. Hall is saying now. Like, we have so much more to say. And he's hinting at Dexter may not be dead. And I don't know. I'll probably end up buying Paramount Plus, which sounds like what it's going to be on now, not Showtime, just to see the prequel in this. But I'm like, I don't know. I keep giving them money and they keep disappointing me. And I know this is an event. I know this is an aviation podcast, but Jesus, who watches Dexter and how ridiculous have those endings been? They probably should have ended it in season 4 when Rita, his wife, passed away, but they didn't. And Jeff keeps going back with his wallet and said, give me some more bad results, please. But okay. All right. Back to aviation. Sorry about that rant on Dexter. Don't really care. It's my podcast. If you don't want to listen, don't fast forward, whatever you want to do. The research aircraft for Maryland, I think it's the Maryland Department of Environment, crashed into a river by Easton Airport. It was a Cessna 402. I don't know. It's interesting. Some of the comments that I'm reading in this section said maybe a possible misviewing. I will say a Cessna 402 could look like to someone who's not aware of the aircraft as a turbine engine. But crashed in 8 feet of water. Pilot unfortunately passed away. Sad situation. Just was reading another article about a Piper Cherokee that had the same fate on takeoff. They did a intersection departure, basically leaving 3,000 feet of runway behind them. Lost the engine, and then the occupants of the aircraft unfortunately passed away due to the incident. So always, as usual, not taking flying for granted at all, and our condolences to the families of those individuals and themselves. But yeah, the Cessna 402 is an interesting aircraft. I used to have a friend that had one of those. It seems like one of those aircraft when people start getting money, or at least some version of money, that they upgrade to as a twin. But obviously you're going from a single engine to a twin aircraft. Not that it sounds like this was this case. Sounds like this was a professional pilot. But, one of those, what they call like the V-tail Bonanza Doctor Killer. A lot more performance. Just makes it a situation where you're trying to, fly in an environment as a professional pilot when you're really doing it as a recreation pilot, at least in the case of like my friend. They were using it to go to their vacation home in Michigan. But and as far as I know, they're fine. I don't think anything ever happened to them, as far as I know. I haven't stayed in much contact with them for years now, but let's knock on wood. Let's see. There's some. All right. That everybody is safe, happy, and content. And I think for a moment here, we'll make this our last story because there's so much we could talk about. We want to just get into what you guys are actually here to listen about. But Southwest Airlines, what the heck's going on over there? They were always supposed to be the low-cost carrier of the mainstay carriers, of the legacy carriers now. And with this new person on their board, an investor, has like $2 billion worth of stock. He has all these ideas about what Southwest should be and what it shouldn't be. And, you've seen over the years, we talked about it before, bags fly free. But anyways, it sounds like he's getting a little bit of his way. They just ditched their 50-year policy of open seating, so they're going to aircraft configuration like the other main carriers where you actually purchase a seat. So no longer will those signs in the airport stand for C, center seat if you're in the C section. I don't know what they're going to do with all those dividers. Maybe they'll be out for auction or in somebody's man cave or woman's cave. In their domicile, but that, and then Spirit Airlines is saying that they're changing their version of flying as well, and now you can basically book a ticket like you would on any other airline where you can include baggage and snacks and all sorts of stuff. So a lot of things are changing, things are moving, but that's the airline industry. So anyways, we're going to get into the story that we alluded to at the beginning of this episode, and we're going to talk a little bit about Germanwings Flight 9525. So Germanwings Flight 9525 was an Airbus A320-211. Its registration was Delta Alpha India Papa X-Ray. The aircraft had about 58,300 flight hours on the aircraft body itself. So on this flight, we had a younger crew. The captain was a 34-year-old male named Patrick Sotomayor, who had 10 years of experience, 6,000 flight hours, and almost 4,000 of that in the Airbus A320, flying for Germanwings, Lufthansa, and Condor. And the co-pilot was a 27-year-old Andreas Lubitz, joined Germanwings in September of 2013 and had 630 flying hours. 540 of those were in the A320. So, a fairly young crew. You see the flying hours, 630 hours in this. Wouldn't be able to do that in the United States. We talked about this with FAA reauthorization. It was something that they pushed for heavily, especially Senator Tammy Duckworth was big on this with the 1,500-hour flying rule for commercial pilots in the United States. As we talked about before, and this is one of the main things that the people that are on the opposition side of this pointed to, was the 1,500-hour rule has not been adopted by the International Civil Aviation Organization, or ICAO, which usually they follow lock and step with anything that happens in the United States and what the FAA puts forward as regulations. But outside of the United States, or even flying into it, as long as it's a foreign flag aircraft operator, you do not need to have the 1,500 hours of flying time, as we see Andreas does not have here. Has a very limited time in comparative to that standard in the Airbus A320. So the flight itself, Germanwings Flight 9525 took off from runway 06 right at the Barcelona airport on March 24th of 2015 at 10:01 a.m. At that point in my life, I would have been in San Jose, California. No, excuse me, I'm going to take that back. I would have been in South Bend, Indiana when this happened. So I would have been in the Crossroads state, which actually I just drove through, or we drove through the other day. And, I always forget now. Something like There's More to Discover, I think is the name, which I would assume means more corn. Kidding, if anybody's listening from Indiana. I live there. It's a nice state. I did have somebody come visit me the other day that was driving from Indiana through Chicago and said, I hate this place. And I texted him back and said, well, that's because people actually live here and they don't live where you live. But that's okay. There's nothing wrong with Indiana. I like the place. I especially like the Indiana Dunes area. That is very nice. Recently made a national park under the Trump administration, and they also have a very nice state park there. But I digress. Back to where we were. I was in South Bend in 2015. So the flight took off 26 minutes behind schedule. It was due to arrive, and I'll probably butcher this, Dulsendorf. I know I've heard it. I know the name. But I'm not great with the pronunciation of that. But Dusseldorf Airport, according to the French National Civil Aviation Inquiries Bureau, the pilots confirmed instructions from French air traffic control at 10:30, so about 29 minutes into flight, and then at 10:31, after crossing over French coast near Toulon, the aircraft left its assigned cruising altitude of 38,000 feet without prior approval and began to descend rapidly. The air traffic controller declared the aircraft in distress after its descent and loss of radio contract. The descent time from 38,000 feet was about 10 minutes. Radar observed an average descent rate of around 3,400 feet per minute. That's pretty significant. 3,400 feet a minute. You're definitely feeling that. Attempts by French air traffic control to contact the flight on the assigned radio frequency were not answered. A French military Mirage jet was scrambled out of the Orange Carriet Air Base to intercept the aircraft. Radar contact was lost at 10:40, so we're now 39 minutes into the flight. At that time, the aircraft had descended to 6,175 feet. So very low, especially if you consider the mountainous range and within it was flying. As we have seen with most of the crashes that we've talked about on this podcast, after radar contact was lost, what happened and what was determined and found to have happened is the aircraft crashed into the slope of a mountain site at that altitude. The aircraft crashed into a mountain range area known as the Raven du Rose. The aircraft crashed on the southern side of Titi du Travers. Yeah, I know. I went to Quebec Day, and I'll know that the way I'm describing these cities, you're probably like, what the heck is he talking about? Mountain ranges near France. That's all you need to know. It was determined that the aircraft was traveling about 435 miles per hour when it struck the mountain. Where this aircraft crashed by coincidence is actually about 6 miles from Mont Signet, which is where Air France Flight 178 crashed in 1953. Helicopters were sent to locate the wreckage. The aircraft had been disintegrated, as we've seen in other stories when we talked about U.S. Airways Flight 427. At this speed and rate, you typically see a disintegration of the aircraft. The largest piece of the wreckage left was the size of a car. A helicopter landed near the crash site. It was confirmed there was no survivors. And the team reported that the debris field covered roughly 500 acres, which obviously is a huge, expansive area for wreckage. As we go along and talk about this story, I want to focus on, obviously, the crew here, and then we'll go into the investigation part here. So Andreas, who we talked about, he was fairly young. He was born in 1987. Raised in Nuremberg, and then he took flying lessons as part of a sports club, and from there he went into the Lufthansa training program after he finished high school. This would have been in September of 2008. Side note, I really start to feel old when I read these, obviously, because I can tell you what I was doing at the time in my job, where this person was just getting ready to start their career. So in this case, Andreas was accepted into the training program. That was in Germany. He suspended his pilot training program in November of 2008 after being hospitalized for a severe episode of depression. After a psychiatrist determined that the depressive episode was fully resolved, Andreas returned to Lufthansa school in August of 2009. Andreas moved to the United States in November of 2010 to continue the training at the Lufthansa Airline Training Center in Goodyear, Arizona. From June 2011 to December 2013, he worked as a flight attendant for Lufthansa while training to obtain the commercial pilot's license here in the United States. He joined Germanwings as a first officer in June of 2014. So from this timeline, right, he basically was flying for about a year when this incident happened. The captain, Patrick Sotomayor, who also was younger, 34 years old, he had a 3-year-old son and a 6-year-old daughter. He switched to flying to this budget airline. He did work for Lufthansa and Condor before that, but cited that it was due to his family and wanted to be closer to them, which is why he made the move over to Germanwings. So as in most crashes, an investigation was opened by the French. It was also opened by their German counterparts, and as usual in this case, especially in a NATO country, right? United States is usually involved if it's a friendly nation to the United States. Even if not, a lot of times they will try to lend their expertise into this. So the United States FBI also was involved. But a couple of things. I mean, obviously, there probably was speculation from the beginning that there was something here that you see more of these law enforcement agents involved. If you remember our incident in Laredo, Texas that we spoke about, the FBI was involved there for a brief moment when it sounded like reports in the ground that there was an explosion. But in this case, there was probably enough suspicion at the beginning to involve these investigative wings to really start to look into it along with safety experts. The cockpit voice recorder was damaged but still functional. It was recovered by rescue workers, examined by the investigation team, and the following week it was reported that the flight data recorder, although blackened by fire, was still usable and had also been found. Investigators also isolated 150 different sets of DNA which were compared with the DNA of the victim's family members. So as you probably can realize from the beginning of this, we focused on both the pilot and the co-pilot. The beginning of this led into the conversation of who we trust in the cockpit, or should I say flight deck. Sorry about that. No longer a cockpit. Now it is a flight deck. Who we led into the flight deck. And so really, I think the mystery becomes who of the two was it, right? Who created a crash incident like this? Was it the first officer or was it the captain? As investigators began to review the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder, it became very apparent who was involved here. So we're going to read a little bit of the accident investigation report. According to French and German prosecutors, the crash was deliberately caused by the co-pilot, Andreas. It was said that Andreas was courteous to the captain during the first part of the flight, then became curt when the captain began the mid-flight briefing on the planned landing. It was said that the captain left the cockpit, probably to use the lavatory. At that time, Andreas locked the door and the override for the door code from the inside, preventing anyone from entering. If you ever see on a United States flight when there's the first officer or captain using the bathroom, it's standard procedure that a flight attendant attends into the cockpit. Actually, it's mandatory that happens. Obviously, this was not over the United States. We talked about that with the 1,500-hour rule. So in this case, they did not have to have somebody else in the flight deck. The override codes in the doors, this was part of 9/11, when if somebody were to take hostage a flight attendant, that they couldn't just open the door. Obviously, as we've talked about, whether it's this or autonomous flying or whatever it might be, every time there's an answer for a security threat, there's another vulnerability, unfortunately. And in this case, the person that they entrusted to make sure that that aircraft landed safely was the one who caused the accident. Or I should say, not accident, deliberately crashed the aircraft. The captain requested re-entry using the intercom. He knocked and then banged on the door but received no response. The captain then tried to break down the door, but like most cockpit doors made after September 11th, it had to be reinforced to prevent intrusion. During the descent, the co-pilot did not respond to questions from air traffic control, nor did he transmit a distress call. It was said that contact from air traffic control tower and the captain's attempts to break in, Andreas steadily breathing, were audible on the cockpit voice recorder. The screams of passengers in the last moment before impact were also heard on the recording. One of the things heard from the captain was, "Open the damn door!" Which there was no reply from Andreas when that was said. After initial analysis of the aircraft's flight data recorder, it was concluded that Andreas had made flight control inputs that led to the crash. He had set autopilot to descend to 100 feet and accelerated the speed of the descending aircraft several times thereafter. The preliminary report into the crash was published 6 weeks later on May 6 of 2015. It confirmed that the initial analysis of the aircraft's flight data recorder and revealed that during the earlier outbound flight 9524 to Düsseldorf, Barcelona, the first officer had practiced setting the autopilot altitude dial to 100 feet several times when the captain was out of the flight deck. The final report into the crash, which was published on March 13th of 2016, confirmed the findings made in the preliminary report, concluded that the first officer had deliberately crashed the aircraft as a suicidal murder. The report stated the collision with the ground was due to the deliberate and planned action of the co-pilot, who decided to commit suicide while alone in the cockpit. Well, let me back up. Flight deck. The process for medical certification of pilots, in particular self-reporting in this case, of a decrease in medical fitness between two periodic medical evaluations did not succeed in preventing the co-pilot, who was experiencing mental disorder and psychotic symptoms, from exercising the privilege of his license. We've talked about this in other episodes. There's been a lot about pilot mental health, stress of the job, stress of the family, just life stress in general. It is a difficult subject, right? It's a difficult subject to talk about. What's the right way? What's the right avenue? What do you do to not penalize people, but also to keep the traveling public safe? 3 days after the crash, German detectives searched the first officer's property and removed a computer and other items for testing. They did not find a suicide note or any other evidence that his actions had been motivated by a political or religious background. During their search of Andreas's apartment, detectives found a letter written by a doctor indicating that Andreas, the first officer, had been declared unfit to work. Germanwings stated it had not received a sick note from Andreas the day of the flight. News accounts said that Andreas was hiding an illness from its employers. Under German law, employers do not have access to employees' medical records, and sick notes excusing people from work do not give information about medical conditions. So employers must rely on the employees to declare their lack of work fitness. The following days, authorities again searched the first officer's home, and they found evidence he suffered from a psychosomatic illness and was taking prescription drugs. Criminal investigators said that the first officer web searches on his tablet computer the days leading up to the crash included ways to commit suicide, cockpit doors, and their security provisions. The doctors had told the first officer he should have not been flying, but a medical secrecy requirement prevented his physician from making information available to Germanwings. Such secrecy should consider public safety, said the investigation team about this incident. The investigation into the first officer revealed his treatment for suicidal tendencies prior to his training as a commercial pilot, when he had been temporarily denied a U.S. pilot's license because of treatments for psychotic depression. For years, Andreas had frequently been unable to sleep because of what he believed were vision problems. He consulted over 40 doctors, fearing that he was going blind. Motivated by the fear that blindness would cause him to lose his pilot license, he began conducting online research about methods of committing suicide before deciding to crash Germanwings Flight 9525. So in the aftermath of this flight, Lufthansa Chief Executive Officer Carsten Sofer visited the crash location. It was the day following the crash. Said it was the darkest day in Lufthansa's 60-year history. Several Germanwings flights were canceled on the 24th and 25th of March due to pilots' grief at the murders and loss of their colleagues. Germanwings retired the flight number 9525, changing it to 9441. The outbound flight number was changed to 9524. In the following days of the crash, Lufthansa at first said it had no reason to change its procedures, then revised its earlier statement by introducing a new policy across its airline requiring the presence of 2 members in the cockpit at all times, following what we talked about earlier with the United States. The regulatory response to this was the co-pilot's involvement. Aviation authorities in some countries implemented new regulations that require the presence of 2 authorized. So it went beyond just the French saying that, following, like I said, what the FAA had put in place, what TSA had put in place here in the United States prior to this incident after 9/11. 3 days after the incident, the European Aviation Safety Agency issued a temporary recommendation to airlines to ensure at least two crew members, including at least 1 pilot, were in the cockpit for the entire duration of the flight. Several airlines announced that they had already adopted similar policies voluntarily, but by 2016, this recommendation had been stopped for the 2-person rule, instead advising airlines to perform risk assessment to decide themselves whether to implement it or not. So no longer a regulatory requirement by Europe. Germanwings and other German airlines dropped the procedure in 2017. So we're back to where we were before. So at least there, I don't know why it doesn't seem like it's that difficult to have 2 people in the flight deck at all time, but they dropped it. The British Psychological Society issued a statement offering expert support in psychological testing and monitoring of pilots. The European Federation of Psychologists issued a statement supporting psychological testing and the selection of pilots, but also stated it could not forecast the life events and mental health problems of individual pilots, nor could it predict the unique ways pilots could cope with these scenarios of just life. It is said that the priority should be given to psychological help for relatives and friends and victims in the aftermath of a disaster. The CEO of Lufthansa proposed random checks for pilots for psychological fitness and a loosening of the extent of physician-patient confidentiality laws. Politicians began echoing this call to loosen the laws in exceptional cases. The National Police Force in France introduced a new set of support mechanisms to minimize psychological risks for relief workers who deal with events like Flight 9525 in their daily jobs. So it's interesting. Some of the stuff that was put in place has been removed. It kind of goes back to like we talked about. You have, procedures put in place. How do you correct them? How do you find yourself in a position where there's something that's foolproof? I think the reality of life is there's nothing that's foolproof. And on the flip side to this, right, people, and we're just talking about this in previous episodes, there's been such a push on the US stage from pilots to talk about mental health. And there's such a secrecy behind it because people are afraid of losing their jobs too if they say that they're dealing with depression or whatever life may have at you. And the reality of life is a lot of people go through these things, right? A lot of us. I mean, the reality of human beings is we have ups and downs. All of us do. So obviously then the reality becomes most people don't either decide to kill themselves or decide to kill themselves and other people. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't be aware of the extremes of mental depression or a mental illness. Obviously, there's certain roles and positions that people shouldn't have if they have severe depression, anxiety, if they've been diagnosed with a mental illness. But on the other side to that, there needs to be a more open dialogue about what people, human beings, go through with life, and that people are not Superman. None of us are. And, we all deal with things. And, I do think that there's a healthy environment, a healthy space for people to discuss these things and to, ensure that incidents and accidents like this don't happen. Because the reality is, even with automation and artificial intelligence, there will be a human factor in everything, at least in the perceivable future. And even when it becomes more autonomous, there will be humans that have the ability to hack systems and get in. Like we said, nothing is ever foolproof. That's how life works. And so the more cognizant we can be about it, the more we can look out for each other. I think the healthier and the better off all of us are going to be. Well, I think at this point, I am going to put a pin in this podcast. We're getting to the witching hour, and by that, I mean minute about 42. And I think at this point, people probably are saying, I can't take another minute of that accent from Michigan. Maybe you can. Maybe you just listen. I don't know. We've been having some pretty good views lately, so maybe people are enjoying it. I hope you are. Once again, feel free to drop us a line anytime you want. dapodcast85@gmail.com. I think the person I get the most emails from is a Peter Clark, who's always asking me to do stuff for his company or for his people. But I don't actually know if he listens to the show because most of his emails look like they're pretty canned, generic, asking me to interview people that he knows, etc., etc. So who knows? If he actually does listen to the show, he can tell me and send me a personalized email, and maybe I'll pay more attention to what he's sending me. But for now, I'll go through and clear out the generic emails I get from him often asking me to plug any of the stuff that he's sending my way or interview any of the people that he is sending my way. Like I spoke about, I will be out in Washington and Renton for a conference here over the weekend and into next week, and then I'll be back. I have a nice little office set up here now. I'm actually borrowing it. Somebody does real work in this office. They run a huge organization out of this area. But I'm using it to do this for now because I sneak in and then I sneak out of this office. I'll sneak attack. But this has been great. Thanks again for listening. Feel free to drop me a line. If you find yourself out in Renton, Washington, you want a sticker, I always travel with them. But until next time, my friends, I will see you down the runway. I did this once before after the plane beep, so I'll just leave this on here if anybody listens to the end. I was watching Creep Show the other day. Yeah, this is not aviation. That's why I put it after the end. I was watching Creep Show the other day, and Creep Show 2, actually, the Stephen King novel from the 80s. Used to watch that back with my parents, and I just wanted to say this. Hello, Billy!